I love danger. Well, welcome to the Growing the Future Mastermind, and this is session 7 of Engine of the Soil. It is CEC and base saturation demystified, because it's definitely a mystery. There's no doubt. And I just wanted to quickly highlight, I was really full of joy the other day when we had a delightful debate in the session with Ian, and Jason Trowbridge joined us. And Jason, give a big shout out to you, Greg, saying that you've been a huge mentor for him. He's been reading your transcripts and following the teaching closely inside the mastermind. What you have explained around soil biology, nutrient balance, and nitrogen efficiency actually lines up with what we're seeing on hundreds of thousands of acres, and it's helped us cut nitrogen, improve balance, and stay profitable when a lot of growers are struggling. And I'm telling you, if agronomists read your transcripts, and they will, because we're going to produce a beautiful coffee table book here with all of this information in color soon, they would be better for it. I think you're teaching some of the most incredible agronomy that's out there, and I'm privileged to be here today, Greg.
Thank you. Hope you get something out of this.
Oh, man, it's so good. So today we're going to be getting more of what's in Greg's head. He's concerned about agronomy, physically going backwards, with recommendations just being enough for, what was it, uptake, not removal?
Crop removal.
Yeah. And yeah, just the way things are going, he wants to correct that. He's on a mission. But of course, a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, and the full transcript and all that good stuff is going to go into the mastermind forever. And Jill has graciously graced us with her presence today, as well as providing the CEU credits. Thanks so much. It was nice to see Jill at the Convergence Conference last week. And as always, we encourage as much interaction as humanly possible. This is your chance to pick the brain of one of the best in the business, absolutely the best in the business. And I want to thank everybody for their participation in the mastermind. I think we're doing really good work here, and I'm going to continue adding content and making it the best community that I can. And keep in mind, it's also your community to get what you can out of it. You've invested your time and your money, so thank you for that. I know there's lots of places for our time and our money these days. Hey, Greg?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, I'm just so excited to hear what you have to say today, Greg, and I'm sure everybody here is. And put a shout out in the chat. Where are you from? What the weather's like? What your questions are? Feel free to chat it up with the group. But Greg, you're on a mission to right all the wrongs in the agronomy world the way that you see it. Why don't you take it away?
I hope that this title hasn't scared people away, because it sounds kind of dry, but I didn't know how else to state what we're going to talk about today. Basically, what I want to do is I want to go through and talk about how we're making recommendations worldwide, but my concern is mainly North America, because I see us going backwards just a little bit. And a lot of confusion out there on what's real. The way we make recommendations here at A&L goes back a number of years with the research we found. And again, we've applied those research criterion to what we do here in field, and all the research we've done with a number of grower groups. Basically, we've proven that this is the way it should be done, and we need to consider that. And most recently, for those who've listened to my soil health work, the soil health research that we've done basically aligns with this original research on understanding nutrient variability and nutrient uptake by plants. And that's what we really want to get to, is hopefully get rid of some of the chatter, some of the noise out there on how we make recommendation soils, because it's very confusing. We got a lot of experts that tell us how it should be done that really don't know. So I want to talk about some articles that I reference all the time. You've seen this one before. I sent it to you as in one of my other presentations, but it's a good study because it's done completely unbiased, and is looking at soil health using good nutrient balance, applying fertilizers the way it should be applied, using this whole approach between understanding the actual optimum level in soil and understanding base saturation. And they proved in the study that over time, with proper balance, that they did increase soil organic matter without applying more. There's enough good residue going back to increase soil organic matter just from the crops they were growing. It did significantly increase biomass accumulation. That's where the organic matter came from. Big influence on biological populations in the soils. And again, dealing with this whole issue on phosphorus, how phosphorus itself at certain balances played a major role in changing the microbial populations in the rhizosphere for these plants. So not just looking at soil yields and impact on the crop we're growing, but also the impact it has on the soil microbiome, and more importantly, going forward in the future, nutrient density. And that's something we really don't pay attention to. And I had a couple of feed people tell me the other day that in the last couple of years, they've seen a real drop in potassium levels in silage, and didn't understand why that was. And I think I'll address that here today because there is a reason for it. One thing, and again, you've seen this one before, but I want to revisit this because it does talk about how the plant produces energy, how every organism on this planet produces energy to survive, and that's in the use of these nutrients. And we start here with potassium. Plant takes up potassium and moves it inside the root system, and that takes energy to do that from this what I call a proton pump, and that comes from converting inorganic phosphorus that it takes up to a form of phosphorus that the plant can store as energy and turn into the what makes our yields. And you can see here that potassium plays a role, magnesium plays a role here in that conversion to convert that phosphorus. So it doesn't matter how much phosphorus you apply or how much is in the soil, without a good balance of potash and magnesium and other elements as well. But more directly involved in this process is the relationship to the ratio between potassium and magnesium to make that whole process function. What we have to do, our challenge is to understand across all the different soil types that we deal with, how do we understand that? How do we put it in place to make it work? We understand that soils have variability. This is a simple triangle that we use to determine clay, silt, loam content in soils. And it's real. There is variability in soils, and it's based on the clay content, the sand content, and the silt content that makes up these soils. And that is all part of understanding what is the cation exchange capacity of these soils and what makes it up. So we have to pay attention to this simple chemistry in soils. It is part of what we're dealing with. So understanding optimum nutrient levels based on soil type using CEC, we'll talk a lot about that. Sands and clays are definitely different. My challenge here is that we've been using this type of information based on some work that Albrecht and Fisher did way back when. And everybody seems to be ignoring that. They're going back to sufficient level and treating soils all the same. So the nutrient load in soils being treated all the same. And that's a concern I have because it's not the way it is. If anybody's ever been in my office, you'll see I'm a bit of a pack rat for books and files and stuff. And I went to one of my files when the 4R thing happened here in Ontario, and I pulled out an old file on field crop recommendations by OMAF back in 1980. Yes, I still have these books, and I pulled this one out. And this one has recommendations for growing crops based on, in this case, 110 to 120 bushel of corn. And there's a phosphate rating based on soil type or soil levels and potash rating. You can see here that they had back in 1980. The problem I have is that, again, they're not treating soils differently. All soils being exactly the same. The optimal level for phosphorus, in this case, a bicarb phosphorus between 10 and 20 ppm, and potash someplace between 80 and 100 is rated medium. But again, no differentiation of soils, which I have a bit of an issue with. When we compare that to Fisher's chart, which actually was put together by all the work done back by Bray and Bear back in the mid-40s, that falls in line with a soil type that has a CEC around 18, that 10 to 20 and 80 to 100 or 160 ppm of potash fit that particular soil type. And that's what that recommendation profile is using. But again, they're treating all soils exactly the same. No matter if it's a sand or a heavy clay, it's all treated like a soil with a CEC of about 18. So we take that another step further. Again, this is a chart out of a recommendation book from 2018, a new OMAF book. Well, now we're getting yields of 250 to plus in corn. Those recommendations have not changed from what they were recommending for a crop between 100 and 120. And again, no inclusion of soil types in those recommendations. So my concern here is we're growing twice a crop and they're still making the same recommendations in this publication from our provincial government here. Nothing different. These are Manitoba guidelines. Again, very standard recommendations based on the same type of parameters that Ontario is using. And again, no definition here to soil type. And again, this is a tri-state recommendations from the US. 3 states just south of the border here. This is the same way they do it. And again, very similar recommendations. The only differentiation here is they do differentiate between soils with CECs less than 5 and in soils with CECs greater than 5. A little bit of definition, but still not nearly enough definition based on the soils that we have to deal with across our growing areas. So I did further research and tried to dig in a little deeper and find a recommendation handbook that did differentiate soil types. And I come across this one from the University of Missouri. And I thought at first that it's Show Me State. They were a little bit more stubborn in how they approach things, but they use a recommendation profile and chart very similar to what we're using in differentiation of soil type and calculation of the desired level of, in this case, potassium in soils based on soil type. So I did find this chart, and then when I dug deeper, this is actually Fisher's work, and Fisher did this work at University of Missouri, and that's why it's still part of their program. So we look at the 2 philosophies that started back in the 1940s when they started analyzing soils and performance of crops. The sufficient level of available nutrients by Bray and that group of researchers, basically applying fertilizer to a number of research plots and watching that, where did the response to fertility actually stop, or fertilizer application actually stop, and where were those nutrient levels at. Same time, another group of researchers looking at the base saturation cation exchange ratio concept to determine how these nutrients play together, the interaction between the different cations, and what was the optimum base saturation of these cations based on soil differentiation. So a little bit extreme philosophies here, but nonetheless very solid in the approach they're taking. So there's good in both of them. Where we're at today and what we've done and what Fisher did is he put it together. So we understand the soil samples, and you've seen this article before. I've sent it to y'all. It talks about where this came from and how it was developed. Again, where it comes from, and again, the base saturation cation exchange ratio concept. And this is back in the mid-40s. But still, at this point, there was not a strong differentiation to soil types. It wasn't until 74 that Fisher put it together. I put this up here. I wrote that article just to show that these ratios mean something. This is out of a Hordes Dairyman article way back in the time, where the feed nutritionists actually use this information looking at milliequivalents of potassium and calcium and magnesium, so the ratios of these, to come up with an understanding if that soil will actually produce a crop that could cause a problem with grass tetany. So we can see that these ratios do make some sense and do apply right through to what comes off the field and we feed the animal. So if we can detect that and we can actually make predictions based on some of these ratios, we know that they're real. And this information is still being used. So look at a soil sample. Here we have one that's typical of that particular area where we had problem. This was a guy who had a problem with cows that were actually sick. And he did a soil test, and he came up with a soil test that said, everything is checked. My potash isn't too high. My ratio is right. I'm below 0.07. So where's my problem? Well, again, it was in variability. We site-specific sampled that field, and we found out that 3/4 of that field would actually produce a crop or forage that would actually make a cow sick, or very close to that. So this particular field had problems, and it was all to do with that balance between those cations. So we do use this. So the SLAN approach to interpreting soil test level, most early agronomists use this approach in interpreting soil tests and making recommendations. And in the past 20, 30 years, many researchers have collected good data that indicate the release rate of nutrients is not the same for all soils. And that's the point we have to make here when we make recommendations. The major differences between soils is due to the amount of clay in the soil. And that's where the base saturation cation exchange ratio concept should be a better predictor of the release rate. So it really wasn't until 1975 that Fisher put this information together, coming up with an interpretation using both of these philosophies and making more sense of soil variability and what the optimum range of these nutrients should be based on soil classification using cation exchange capacity. So there's some real science behind this, and not that either of these concepts are wrong, it's just that they come at it from two different angles. And again, the SLAN approach is not looking at soil type differentiation. So we look at that work that Fisher did, and we understand what he tried to do. He's saying that there's several ways to interpret, in this case, K levels. One is determined by base level of adequate or optimum growth of a given crop based on a specific nutrient level. If that release of K is not influenced by soil type, then the value would be the same for all soils. And that's kind of what he's alluding to here. This concept is called or referred to as the sufficient level of available nutrients, where it does not differentiate soil types. Whereas the second interpretation would be established the percentage of CEC that the K needs to occupy, in which would supply the needs of the crop, or the base saturation concept that is referred to here. Using this concept, as CEC of the soil changes, the sufficient level of potash would also change. So this concept is including the variability of soils. Most early agronomists were using this SLAN approach and not paying attention to sufficient levels of different soil types. And they saw from this part that, from the data they collected, that greater than 5 pounds of K per acre was needed for crop production. And at relatively low soil test levels on some soils, it was able to provide that. But on other soils, it was not able to provide the adequate levels of potassium to that crop. So we're seeing some inconsistencies here across different soil types. The optimum soil test level for each of these concepts have been established at approximately 100 to 110 parts per million of potassium in soils. And that's the SLAN value. And that's the value that Fisher uses in his formulas, and it's a real value. But that value has to change based on soil type. The base saturation cation exchange ratio requires 2 to 5% of the exchangeable cation, and potassium in this case, to be the sufficient level. So one discipline saying that it's 100 to 110 ppm to be where you have to be in the optimum zone. The other one is saying it doesn't matter how much it is or how many ppm it is, it has to be 2 to 5% of the exchange site. Fisher's hybrid formula incorporates both SLAN and the base saturation level in a formula that takes these two and marries them together. And in doing that, we do identify different soil types, and we do distinguish how these different soils will perform. I'll get to it a little bit later, but what we're looking at here is the coefficient of diffusion of these nutrients from the soil particle, or in other words, what the soil can actually liberate over the growing season into soil solution for plant availability. So if you look at the coefficient of diffusion model, which I'll show you here in a little bit, it's very complicated. This concept that Fisher put together is a lot easier method in understanding what that coefficient of diffusion is. Here's a couple examples looking at CEC 11, where the desired soil test K level using the SLAN approach at 110 ppm, and then the base saturation of 2 to 5%. And you look at this formula here, and in this particular study, both of these formulas actually produced pretty reasonable results. So using either one or the other, you got pretty decent recommendations from that. This is another example in the same trial using a CEC of 22, where when you use the SLAN approach interpretation, it underestimated the needed requirement for potassium in this case, where the base saturation interpretation overestimated the desired test level for corn in this situation. So in some cases, they concurred, but in this particular case, you can see they did not. But when you marry them together and use them both for determination of nutrient loads, we do get a consistent understanding of nutrient availability. And that's Fisher's hybrid formula, where he looks at the desired soil test K level using that 110 base level of potassium. And then to that desired K level, he added 2.5 times the cation exchange capacity to come up with what that actual desired level would be as you change soil types, if that makes sense. So the baseline bottom end for optimum level is 110 ppm. That's where you start. And then to that, you add a calculation or additional ppm levels for determining optimal levels based on the cation exchange. Hopefully that made sense. He also did the similar formula for phosphorus. So again, trying to marry both the SLAN approach and the base saturation cation exchange approach together to come up with something that basically differentiates soil types. And the reason I'm taking the time today to do this is solid. And I've done this in field for over 45 years. It does work. It works. And when you walk into a field, I used to be a consultant as well. It made real sense on how to do that. So when you look at his
Greg,
formula,
we had a question here from Jill.
Yep. Yes.
STP, that's STPD. Define that. What is the STP?
Soil test preferred, or does soil STP is soil test phosphate desired. STPO is soil test phosphate observed, so off the soil test. So one is your target, where you want to go to, and you can take that off the charts. So let's say the desired level was 40 parts per million, and your soil test said you had 30 parts per million, so you take the difference, and then you take the cation exchange capacity divided by 2 to give you the amount of phosphorus that you have to add to that soil test, divided by the number of years you're going to build. It could be 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and that is what your build factor would be going into that phosphate formula. Make sense?
Absolutely. It makes 110%. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Jill.
So again, looking at using his hybrid formula, this is the type of chart that we use. You can see here as your, and what you don't see here is as your crop changes or as your yield changes, there's a different optimum level of potassium, or it could be phosphorus, that is needed to be built in that soil to provide the nutrients to build that level or build that crop yield. The Fisher factor on the bottom is basically, if you look at that one middle level at 1.1, that's 110. So that's established that 110 ppm that comes from Fisher's work and Bray and Bayer's work. And either side of that is the level of that optimum base level you would need based on crop, based on soil type as you move forward. So that's just kind of showing you how there's differentiation as we move to crop demand and crop type. So maybe I can break down a little easier. If I have a crop of grain and I got a CEC someplace between 15 and 17, I'm going to need about 160 ppm in that soil to be adequate or in the optimum range. If I'm pushing for a higher yield, let's say I'm going from 100 bushel to 150 bushel, I'm going to need probably 189 or 190 ppm to be sufficient to release enough potassium over the growing season to feed that crop over and above what I put on. So it does change with demand. The bigger the crop demand, the bigger the grocery bag needs to be to feed that crop. And that's what Fisher's charts and tables basically are trying to point out here. As you push for higher yields, you have to have a bigger nutrient load in that soil just to make up that difference. So you look at going from another nutrient here, and calcium is the one that really gets forgotten. It is the most abundant nutrient in our soils other than aluminum, but it's required by crops in large amount, and it's fairly benign. We put lots of it on, and it's not toxic to plants, but it's needed in large amounts because it does so much in building the cell structure of the plant and just contributing to the overall biomass. And again, we look at different needs for calcium. And from this research work here, it's saying many crops respond to calcium applications when the percent saturation of calcium falls below 25%. Well, that's a no-brainer. We see that all the time. In the West, you have a lot of kaolinite soils that are release nutrients very easily, particularly potassium, but in this case, even calcium. So we only need about a 50% base saturation of calcium for most crops in these types of soils to satisfy the crop's needs. So again, we see that across different soil types. You start talking about the majority of the soils that are clays, and montmorillonite soil here and other clays require a base saturation of 70% saturation to provide sufficient amounts to grow most plants. So again, we're looking at soil type differentiation. We're looking at analyzing calcium needs other than pH, which I talked to in my previous presentations. But again, it's breaking it down by different clay concentrations, different clay amounts. And in the end, we can break it down further into different crops. I mean, I'm talking about a crop of alfalfa. I would want that base saturation in that montmorillonite clay or clays like that to be at least 75% to make sure I get the yields I want and the quality of the nutritional value of that alfalfa. Also, maintaining a relationship in all soils of calcium and magnesium together, greater than 75%, gives you a very energy-loaded soil and basically alleviates all other issues like metal toxicities and other issues and other nutrient availability in soils. So again, we see these relationships as we go further in looking at the variability of soil types and how those soil types will actually liberate or give up these nutrients. In my other presentation, we talked about calcium deficient soils and some of the key indicators we see when you have calcium deficiencies, things like weed pressures, sow thistle, foxtails, fall panikin, clubroot, Aphanomyces, Sclerotinia. These are all indicators that your crop is suffering from calcium deficiencies or lack of calcium availability.
Are you able to coach producers on what are some of the optimum crops for soil types? Do some crops perform much better in different soil types?
Yeah, we can do that. But unfortunately, we migrate to a crop that will grow in a soil that's in bad shape because at least we get something out of it. Whereas I would rather fix the soil. Now, that being said, I've made lots of recommendations. I made a recommendation to a grower one time that wanted to put a crop of potatoes in the field, and I told him, don't do that. That field cannot support a crop of potatoes. Put in a wheat crop and build that soil up so that it's ready to put a crop of potatoes in. And he didn't like that. He wanted to grow potatoes. He wanted to do that.
Yeah.
So he put them in anyhow. Well, the next spring when I sat down to make recommendations for him again, he said, Greg, I should have listened to you. I grew potatoes in that field where you told me not to, and they basically all run out the door. I couldn't store them. So when we make a recommendation for soil type based on the crop's ability to withstand certain deficiencies, it's usually because that crop can tolerate it. Not that the crop's happy, but at least we get some kind of return by putting it in there. And a lot of times when I see very, very poor soil types and I know it has to be built, I'll recommend a grower puts a crop in there that has low inputs, so he's not investing a lot of money in growing that crop, but at least has something to cover the field, and he's getting some return while he spends the money in that field to bring it up to a better nutrient load so that other crops can be grown with good economic return, if that makes sense. Another question?
We have a question coming in from Jason. This will impact water use efficiency in our drier areas.
Absolutely. I'll get to that a little bit later in this presentation. When we talk about the coefficient of diffusion, that is a model that has been looked at by soil chemists and understanding that we get nutrients dissolved in soil solution that the plant takes up, and then we get nutrients that are on the soil particle that have to be released into soil solution for the plant to give it up to crops. The higher the moisture content, the more effective your coefficient of diffusion is. In other words, there's a direct relationship to nutrient availability in water, which we all know. So that's understood. However, if I increase the ion concentration on the soil particle, that portion of the coefficient of diffusion is increased because of the concentration on the soil particle. So even in droughtier conditions, that soil will still have the ability to release nutrients because there's such a strong difference in nutrient gradient from the soil particle into soil solution, if that makes sense. In other words, I can overcome drought to some degree by putting higher levels of that nutrient on soil particle. Let me give you a simple understanding of that. If anybody's ever listened to the Hefty Brothers down in the U.S., I'll say corn needs to have a base saturation in a clay loam soil of someplace between 3 and 5%. Now that's in an area where we have decent rainfall. They'll tell you they want between 5 and 7% saturation on the soils they're dealing with because they're in dry land situation. So what they're doing is they're overloading the soil because they know that it will be restricted to the amount of potassium it can release in dry conditions. So when you look at the coefficient of diffusion, the way to overcome that is I put a higher ion concentration on the soil particle so that even in drought conditions, I still have the soil willing to give up more of that nutrient, if that makes sense. That
Jason, did you have anything to add to that? I'm wondering a little bit. Jack Feenstra is saying, why did Dr. Albrecht want 1% Na? Question mark 3 times.
He said he wants less than 1% sodium. We need some sodium. Sodium needs to be in part of it because it's going to be there. But we know that the baseline level of sodium in most soils that aren't droughty soils will be someplace under 1% base saturation. And I tell people that I work with here, particularly in sod and people that work along roadways, that if you have greater than 1% saturation in Ontario soils, you've got sodium coming from some other source and you need to figure out where that's coming from. Because most crops, a lot of crops can tolerate greater than 1%, but once you get over 1%, especially once you get over 2.5%, you start seeing crop production issues. So
Jack's asking, where does yield loss start on irrigation?
Where does yield loss starts on irrigation when you don't understand what your water quality is? A lot of times, if your bicarbonate load or your sodium load is not where it should be, and you irrigate, you're actually turning crops backwards. In southwestern Ontario, when I deal with a lot of horticultural growers here, they have irrigation and they turn the tap on because their neighbor is. And a lot of times their bicarbonate levels are greater than 200 ppm, and every time they irrigate, they're actually setting the crop backwards. So if somebody tells me that an inch of irrigation water is not as good as an inch of rainfall, I'm saying that you've got a problem with irrigation water, because irrigation water should be just as effective if your bicarbonate levels are between 80 and 120. So to be effective with irrigation water, we need to know what's there. And in a lot of cases in Western Canada, you're pulling water out of rivers or areas where you have a sodium load, and the sodium load in that irrigation water you're putting on the soil is going to increase your sodium. And it's taking nutrients away from the plant just because it's reversing that osmotic pull because of the amount of salt that you're putting around the root system. So irrigation water is effective if you know what your irrigation water is like. If it's not, in case of high sodium irrigation water, you should be treating that water with gypsums to dissipate the sodium when you apply it, or it's just to accumulate and cause you more problems. If your bicarbonates are over 140, for instance, in this part of the world, you need to be using some kind of acid, either sulfuric acid or phosphoric acid, to drop that down to between 80 and 120. On the same light, we don't want to drop bicarbonates less than 80 because it can reverse and do as much damage as it goes below on bicarbonate loads. So there is all irrigation water is not the same, and we need to understand what an ideal irrigation water is, and if it's not there, we need to treat it or don't use it unless you absolutely have to.
Yeah, we got Jason on the call now. Jason, you want to expand on that water use efficiency chat?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Jason.
Okay, good. I don't know if Greg remembers me or not. I was in class probably 2013. I was with the McRae group that came down to Ontario.
Well, I
learned lots
apologize.
of
I don't
stuff.
remember you, but there's a lot of people go through my classes. But
Absolutely, and I understand that 100%, Greg. But
yeah,
you had a big impact on me, and I've followed this, particularly the potassium to magnesium ratio. So I've got some colonies in what they call special areas in Alberta.
yeah,
They're special, all right. That land is rough, it's dry, but we're able to pull off 2 and 3 times the yield of neighbors by dropping our nitrogen, making sure our potassium is there, making sure our phosphorus program's in place. We've actually got fields now that we haven't fertilized with NP or K. We've just used calcium, sulfur, and boron, and we haven't seen NPK for 4 years. And our soil test levels are climbing. So, absolutely, 100%. The rain is what we get. If we get a rain, we get a yield. If we don't get a rain, we don't get anything. But water use efficiency is definitely impacted by making sure you have sufficient levels in the soil.
yeah, absolutely. And you've probably got some, because of the colonies you're working with, you've probably got some very, very rich soils because of how they farm, and those nutrients not being available because something was a bit out of balance, and you've made some adjustments and you're seeing it come now. A soil that's in good shape can provide a lot of nutrients for a crop, but keep an eye on it because you'll get to a level where you're drawing a lot of that out and you start going backwards. So you just want to make sure that you don't rob the bank, and you want to keep that up. And that's why it's good to understand what the optimum levels are. It's good to understand how to make these recommendations. That's why I'm taking time to talk about it here today. You can make your own recommendations, and you should be making your own recommendations based on a soil test if you understand how they're put together. And that's what we do in level 2. And this year, level 3, I'm going to take it a little bit further in understanding some of these ratios. And don't get hung up on the ratios. And the ratios I talk about are in mill equivalents, not parts per million. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But the ratios need to be in the right ratio, but the ratios have to be coming from the right nutrient load to start with. In other words, if you make a ratio like K to magnesium ratio out of low potash and low magnesium, and it's where it should be, but both your potash and magnesium are low, it's not going to work. So first of all, we have to look at what the sufficient level should be, and then what is the relationship between these different nutrients in ratio to make sure it's most efficient, if that makes sense. So we just can't rely on ratios alone. We got to rely on what is the optimum level that makes up that ratio. If we understand what I'm trying to say here.
Did you have anything else to add, Jason?
I was just going to say one of the things that we've found is calcium is way more important than anybody else thought. So we're dealing with base saturations on calcium anywhere from 30 to 60%. And I'll hit 70% on some soils and still not be sufficient, even on sandy soils. So,
on sandy soils particularly, you get soils with CECs below 6, you're going to have to be at 75% saturation or better just to get enough calcium to grow that crop.
I've got nothing below 11. I don't see CECs of 6 on any of my land that I've got, even the worst stuff that I've got. We're at 11 plus, but I've got CECs as high as 45.
Oh yeah. And those soils are absolutely amazing soils for the energy they have. If you have the right calcium.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of those high CEC soils are high magnesium. And you've got to knock that magnesium out of there. And the way to do that is with calcium.
Only 39%.
You got a challenge. You got a challenge.
We're pulling 18-ton silage off 39% magnesium field.
Well, yeah, those high CEC soils, especially those black clays, black mucks, they are powerful soils. And they've done what they've done for years because they are so powerful, even though they're so far out of whack. But as you work with those and provide a little more calcium to those soils, you're going to see them really perform. And you probably have.
Yeah, well, we're getting there. We actually did a pivot. We did a bunch more soil testing this past fall. Exactly what you say. We did more base sites to see where our potassium levels were. The best spot in the field for the past 3 years is where our K to MG ratio is bang on at 0.25. And the rest of the field that suffers, the worse the ratio gets out of whack, the worse the yield is.
Yeah.
And we've dumped lots of calcium on that field, lots of potassium, and we're getting there, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, I watched some of the fields out there where CECs were 35 to 40, some real black clay soils, and it was dry. I mean, you have to watch that you didn't fall down one of the cracks because you wouldn't come out. But very powerful soils, and in a lot of cases, very few inputs put on them. As long as they got rainfall, they performed. But if we feed them and we bring some of those things in balance, and particularly calcium in those soils, they really perform.
Yeah,
What's your favorite? What's your favorite Hutterite wine, Jason?
I actually have not been introduced to Hutterite wine.
What?
No.
I had a nice berry one the other day. It was pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyhow, so I just want to put this up here talking about Albrecht because
You're good, Jason. There was another question here from Nathan,
Okay.
but are you good, Jason? Anything else to add?
Yeah. No, I'm fine for now. Thanks.
Thanks for coming
go
on.
ahead then. Nathan, go ahead.
So Nathan is asking, did you say treat water with gypsum or the soil with gypsum that receives high sodium water?
Some people are actually treating their water.
Uh-huh.
They're putting a very soluble grade of gypsum right in their water so that when the water goes on, the sodium is being dissipated as soon as it hits the ground by the gypsum.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Nathan? Let us know if you have any follow-up questions, Nathan. Thank you. Okay. Continue on there, Greg.
Okay. Again, looking at Albrecht, and a lot of people think he was a madman. He was actually a vet. And he looked at soil nutrition through what he was feeding his livestock. And, he came up with these ratios and these concerns of that ratio, the one I shared with you on grass tetany. And he came up with CECs and base saturation of 65% calcium, 15% magnesium, 4% potassium, and 1% sodium. And this is a generalization and general guideline because, again, that ratio doesn't fit all soils. But it was really close for most. So this is the types of ratio that he put together on what the base saturation needed to be and what the ratios in calcium, magnesium, potassium ratio. But this is in parts per million. And that has a bit of an issue here, as I'm going to share with you in a minute here. And these are New Jersey soils. And when you look at what has happened since Albrecht did that work and since he published that, a lot of researchers take that information and try to disprove him. And that 13-part calcium to 2-part magnesium and 1-part potassium comes from that previous slide. They show there's absolutely no impact to crop response in trying to balance these ratios. But again, that's in one soil type. And that's where the differences depart. I mean, you can't look at parts per million of calcium, magnesium and come up with a ratio that's going to fit all soil types because it changes with soil type. So you look at generalization of what he's saying, 3 to 5% saturation of potassium, 10 to 20% mag, 60 to 8% calcium, 10 to 20% hydrogen. That's a kind of a general rule coming from Albrecht's information. However, that's not the real world. If you look at different soil types going from CEC to 5 to 25, in a CEC of 5, based on, again, Fisher's formulas, I need 5 to 7% K, 18% mag, 65 to 75% calcium, and 20 to 25% hydrogen. That has to add up to 100. You cannot do that. So what that tells you is if you're going to keep your K to magnesium ratio at between 0.2 and 0.35, and if you're going to keep your calcium between 65 and 75, you need some hydrogen in that formula. You need to be putting some kind of sulfur on or something that's going to acidulate that zone to balance that off because you can't make that happen. If you look at a CEC of 15, I can balance that soil. It works, and they're easy soils to balance. But as you get into higher soils, higher clay content, they're difficult to balance because nine times out of 10, your base saturation of magnesium's either way too high or your calcium's way too high. And again, it's a natural property of the soil. It's difficult to balance. So anybody who tells you they can balance your soils doesn't understand the soils. You can balance the nutrients you provide your crop to provide the missing pieces, but you'll go mad trying to balance some of these soils.
What percentage of agronomists understand this in your estimation in Western Canada, Greg, or across Canada?
Well, I don't think very many do because we've got too many people trying to push the SLAN approach at everybody where they're not talking about soil differentiation. And if you don't understand the variability of soils and what the optimum level is across different soils, it's really difficult to grasp this, if that makes sense. So that's why I'm doing this podcast today and talk about we really got to get a grasp of the variability in soils and how that impacts this nutrient availability. And we really have to understand what Fisher put together in trying to differentiate soil types and some of the hybrid models that he's developed that take both the SLAN approach and the base saturation approach and put them together, both best of both worlds, to get a better understanding of availability. This next slide here is something we've done in the past to take this a little bit simpler to everybody. This is a simple cheat sheet. CECs of less than 7, your calcium to magnesium in milliequivalents needs to be 3-to-1. 7 to 25, your calcium to magnesium in milliequivalents needs to be 5-to-1. And calcium to mag and heavy clay soils needs to be 6-to-1. Always trying to maintain a 0.2 to 0.35 K to magnesium ratio in milliequivalents. Now, this is impossible. You're not going to get this, be able to accomplish this in all soils because soils just can't be balanced that way. But if I can look at these simple parameters, when I'm looking at a soil test, it quickly tells me where I'm out of whack. Do I need to apply calcium? Do I need to apply magnesium? Or is it potassium? So it gives you a better direction on what the most limiting factor is in that field and where to spend my resources to try to correct it in either the fertility that I'm providing or in trying to correct that soil deficiency, if that makes sense. You're on mute, Dan.
Jack is saying, and the ones that try get thrown under the bus and labeled as quack quack.
And that's the problem. We've got too many people that don't apply this in the field. In other words, they've never grown a crop, they've never had to farm, that say these things don't work. The people that are in the field that are taking this information and trying to make sense out of it and apply it to their own situations, just like Jason, they are getting success. I mean, they're not balancing the soil, but they're understanding what they're dealing with, and they're applying all kinds of different techniques to be able to grow the crop and deal with some of these insufficiencies.
Nathan is asking, how does a person sign up for your courses, Greg?
Well, there's level 2, which is a 1.5 day course where we talk about nutrient availability and soil chemistry, and we spend half a day just in classroom helping you walk through how to make a recommendation. And that course has still got openings in it. It's geez, I should have that right at my fingertips. I don't.
Is that in person somewhere?
Yes, that's in person. We were going to have one in Western Canada. We had one that we were going to put on in Saskatoon, but we didn't get enough people sign up for it, so we had to cancel it. But there's still another one going on here in London, and we can take up to 100 people at that course. There's only probably 20 or 30 signed up so far. It's in the middle of March. No, level 2 is in 2 weeks.
Maybe Sierra's on the call. Maybe you want to get, we can put some information on that in the course.
Sarah, can you?
In the mastermind there, Sierra, or can you type it in the chat if you have access to any of that information?
And also put in when level 3 is going to be.
Nathan would love more info.
Yeah. And we encourage people to come to the in classroom. We used to do some virtual, but level 2, it's really hard to do virtual. It's better if you're here because it's the feedback. I'll be there. I have Chris and Mike and Beth working in the classroom with everybody, working through some of these equations to answer these. And hopefully when you walk away from that course, you've got a better understanding of how to do this.
Cool. That sounds exciting. Jason says he wears his crazy label with pride. We should get you a t-shirt or something.
But this is you're absolutely right. This is the problem we have. I mean, there's a lot of naysayers out there that, again, the universities don't teach Fisher's or Albrecht's information. They teach the SLAN approach. They teach and deal with all soils as the same. Anybody that has anything to do with agriculture, or anybody who has worn a pair of boots across a field on a rainy day, knows there's a big difference between sands and clays. I mean, it's common sense approach. I think everybody in this classroom here would admit there's a difference between sands and clays. Difference how they grow the crop, difference on their moisture requirements. There's a difference on their nutrient requirements.
Jack can guarantee 10 to 20 rednecks if you do the course in Lethbridge. That's all? I'm sure there's more rednecks in Lethbridge.
Well, I'll tell you,
isn't everybody a redneck?
Well, again, we can't do it for this year, but Jack, send that request through to me or Sierra. We'll make sure we have it on the agenda for next year.
Sierra's on top of it.
Okay, so this is just a chart showing you the difference between sands and CECs and clays. This is well documented. This is not something I invented. This is just how, if you look at CEC, these soils would classify. So it's something we need to understand. This is a soil type here, and this is typically what we run up against in Western Canada. This is a Western Canada soil test. And too often we hear from people that we've got all kinds of potash. We mine it out here. But when you look at this soil test, particularly, we look at the level of potassium at 200 and 3 and 4 of topsoil, the 3A and 4A subsoil, or the lower soils. We got 200 ppm of potash. We got 199 ppm of potash. And when you look at the SLAN approach, anything over 110 is optimum. So that would suggest, now we only rate it medium here because we do differentiate soil types, but with a CEC of 35, even people say, I've got enough potash there because that's what the literature tells me. When we look at that realistically, we only have 1.5% saturation of K in that soil. We need over 2% to have availability. Plus we got high magnesium that's competing with that K. And we've got low levels of calcium. So things are out of balance and things we need to correct. And then we look at the K to magnesium ratio in that soil. If you drop below 0.15, you have a productivity problem. Now, as Jason was saying, your CECs are 35 and 40. That's such a strong soil. It's making up for a lot of sins here. So it has a lot of potential, but there's a lot of potential in that soil that's not being appreciated because the potassium load's not there. When you look at this chart here, again, this chart is our tech bulletin. It comes from Fisher's work. And, we're looking at medium soil between 80 and 160 in a CEC of about 16 to 25. And then we look at where it would be in a heavier soil or over that, we want to have between 100 and 200 ppm. But in a case of that soil we just looked at 35, you want to be between 200 and 400 ppm to be in the range. And we can do a calculation on CEC to show you how that fits. But in that soil type, we want to be between 2 and 3% K for that to work. So when you do that, in sample 3, I would have to have 275 part per million of potassium in that soil to get to that 2%. In sample 4, I'd have to have 248 ppm of potassium to get to that 2%. So you're close, and you're close to that optimum range. And given you have adequate rainfall with that 200 ppm of potassium, you'll get a crop. But if you have dry weather, that field's going to suffer. So we look at differences in soil types and difference in holding capacity. When you look at CEC at 25, it has a lot more exchange sites. The soil has a lot more potential than the sandier soil on the right. So it will forgive a lot of things we do wrong, provided we have the moisture. The soil with CECs of 5, less forgiving, moisture or not. So we do have to understand the differences between these soil types and how they retain and give up nutrients. Again, comparing that sand at CEC 5 to a CEC at 20, you can see where the optimal ranges need to be in those different soils of K, magnesium, calcium, just to be in the sufficient zone, and how that correlates to ppm, and it correlates to CEC. Now, in SLAN's approach, all those ppm potassium would be 100 to 110, not anywhere from 120 to 250. So again, we're seeing a differentiation here based on soil type, which Fisher put together in that information. When we look at production agriculture, we have to really look at and lean on potassium. Potassium availability is what's in soil solution, what's readily available on the exchange site, and then what's fixed. And I'm going to show you here how potassium creates yields. But before we go there, when you look at a clay particle, and you look at the potassium on this clay particle in the P position, that's basically the very readily available and selective availability. You look at the potassium that's in the E position, that's the slowly available form of potassium that will come from that soil. Then the I position is fixed very strongly between these clay platelets and very unavailable to the crop. So when we look at potassium and why it has such a big impact on yields, although we know that nitrogen is fundamental for production of crops, proteins, and other carbohydrates, plants that are deficient in potassium will not produce their proteins despite how much nitrogen you put on. And what happens here is we get incomplete proteins such as amino acids and amines and other unlikelies that accumulate in the cell and cause all kinds of problems. Starch synthesis is activated by potassium. So under inadequate potassium levels, the level of starch actually declines, while we actually start accumulating these soluble carbohydrates that are nitrogen-based that are very detrimental to the quality of the crop and other things that are going on. So lower amounts of starch means less amounts of it moving into the source or sink, and poor quality and poor yields at the end. The plant tissue, the leaves, become full of these soluble carbohydrates and turn soft and fleshy, and actually attract insects and disease to those crops. And one particular one is asparagine that's accumulated in these crops. And that's something that attracts aphids and mites and all kinds of other insects, but it's also something that accumulates that we've learned recently through the World Health Organization, that when we process these crops, produce acrylamides, which are a carcinogen. So again, this relationship potassium and nitrogen use is real. So when we look at, again, this is a chart we use all kinds of times looking at this nitrogen potassium relationship, and Jason mentioned it already that his efficiencies in nitrogen use change with some of the things he's doing. If you look at this chart here, and we'll use 3% organic matter as kind of an example here, and how much nitrogen is contributing to 3% organic matter. And if I was to grow a crop of wheat with a yield goal of 100, and my K to magnesium ratio in that 3% organic matter, I'd be looking at about 146 pounds of nitrogen to grow that crop. If my K to magnesium ratio is between 0.15 and 0.2, I would need about 155 pounds of nitrogen to do the same thing. And then if I drop below 0.15, I'm going to need almost 170 pounds of nitrogen to grow that same crop. So your nitrogen use efficiency drops based on your available potassium and that K to magnesium ratio that we're talking about here. So again, your nitrogen use efficiency in a soil that has a low GFI, I need more general fertility index. I need more nitrogen to grow that crop. If my general fertility index or my overall fertility in that field is in balance, I can use lower levels of nitrogen. Now, our soil health research we've done here, if you look at the soil health index, if I get my soil health index over 40 in these soils, I can use 50% of the nitrogen I normally use because I have nitrogen fixing bacteria in that soil that this plant is starting to feed and cultivate that are going to help me with my nitrogen use. So we do understand this and we do see this. And again, that whole K to magnesium ratio between 0.25 and 0.35, I demonstrated there from that one chart that we use on a regular basis. And that chart is something we put together based on some variable rate nitrogen research we've done over a number of years using these different ratios to come up with, can we variable rate apply nitrogen? And what are some of the indicators we have in the soil? We started out with that K to magnesium ratio as one indicator and developed prescription based on that. Then we went to another index that some people are still using it in Western Canada called our general fertility index to come up with a variable rate nitrogen model. And that model works very well. But I'm working on another one now, looking at the soil health index as even a more aggressive model on how I can variably apply nitrogen. So when we look at some of these ratios, they do have a big impact. In this case, again, looking at fertilizer sources, my K magnesium ratio will be between 0.25 and 0.35 is where we want to be. But again, making sure that potassium-magnesium ratio is coming from the ideal base saturation of K and mag for that soil. If they're not correct, the K to mag ratio is not going to be as effective as it could be. K to mag over 0.4 means I have poor magnesium availability, need to work on that. And then K to magnesium below 0.15 indicates low potassium. So also this information helps us in our choice of fertilizer inputs. Is it a sulfate of potash, a muriate, or a sulfate of potash magnesia that I need to put in my program? So let's look at potassium again, with a little more detail. Potassium is a unique element and how it's taken up by the plant. We need sunshine, we need rain to get potassium into the plant. But when we look at a soil test and you want to understand your potassium availability and what is the chance of release of potassium from that soil, we need to look at the part per million potassium in the soil. We need to look at where that sits as far as the soil type. So what is the optimum level in that soil type? We need to understand the percent saturation of K relative to that. I just talked about the K to magnesium ratio, but another one we're not talking about a lot today is boron. We need adequate boron just to get potassium taken up by the plant, and that's another whole story for another day. But what we need to understand is, and a lot of people look at nitrogen is the determining factor for yield, but it's not. It's potassium. Potassium is how the plant assimilates CO2, how the plant basically performs photosynthesis. And the higher potassium level in the plant, the more efficient your photosynthetic capability is of that plant. This is a chart right in a Marshner. And this is looking at fertilization of a crop. We're looking at leaves taken from the top of the plant down through the plant in a well-fertilized crop, and then a K-stressed crop. And you can see here at the top of the plant, in a well-fertilized plant, we've got K content of about 1,600 milligrams per gram. In the K-stressed, we're only at 2,100 milligrams per gram. And you can see on the far right-hand side, the amount of photosynthesis taking place down through that canopy directly correlates to the amount of fresh potassium in that plant tissue. So you're looking at the efficiencies of the plant's ability to produce photosynthates, energy in that plant, based on potassium content through that canopy. This is again based on the same information. A leaf with potassium levels of 12.8 milligrams per gram, 19.8 and 38.4, and you look at the right-hand side, you see the photosynthetic rate in the middle at 11.9 up to 34, but then you see on the right-hand side the way the plant actually uses that energy that's stored in a photorespiration or dark respiration mode. That's how it consumes the ATP that's produced. In the top one at 12.8, if you add the photorespiration and dark respiration together and subtract that from the photosynthesis, you'll see that crop's in trouble. It's likely not going to survive. Whereas you go down to this middle one and you add the two together and subtract it from 21.7, you've got a lot more reserve ATP or photosynthase that's going to go into production of the crop we're growing. That crop's going to do quite well. But the bottom one with the higher leaf potassium levels, a significantly higher level of reserve photosynthase after the sun comes back out the next day. The other thing you need to recognize here is that the dark respiration process is much more efficient in providing energy to that plant than the photorespiration is much more efficient than the dark respiration phase. So the more energy being consumed in the photorespiration phase, the more efficient the plant is. And the lower the potassium content, the more of that goes to the dark respiration phase, which is less efficient. So again, the efficiencies of the plant's ability to use the photosynthase and CO2 that's assimilating in the leaves is greater with higher potassium levels. So this is why I say that potassium is what produces yield. And we need to focus on that and make sure that we have good available potassium. We look at tissue samples taken. Again, this is a corn crop. If I have good levels of potassium in the plant and I've got CO2 fixation and my levels are 1.7 to 2% in early stages, this plant's doing quite well. But if I have lower levels of that in the leaf in the early stages, this plant's going to suffer, and the photosynthesis in this plant is going to drop very, very quickly. So again, we understand, looking at the photosynthetic rate of how crops perform, how important potassium is to this crop. So look at just how potassium is released. For every time we put
There's a couple
potassium on,
questions here, Greg. I just want to slow you down for a second.
Yeah.
Nathan is asking, can you comment on the effect of chloride when potash is applied?
The effect of chloride?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, muriate potash has a bad rap. A lot of the organic growers said that chloride's a poison. It's chlorine. It's poison. Chloride is actually an essential element. We see some crop response in some crops more from the chloride than we do the potassium. So it's a good thing. The thing with muriate of potash is it's not as readily taken up by the crop because the efficiencies or the selectivity for chloride is greater than potassium. So when I put muriate of potash on, the plant will take up chloride faster than it takes up potassium. Where sulfate sources of potassium, the sulfate is not as dominant as the potassium, and I get better plant uptake of potassium than I use sulfates. Not long term, so they're both excellent for building soils, but for direct plant uptake, your sulfate sources are more readily available to the crop than your muriate of potash, if that answers the question.
Let us know if we answered your question there, Nathan, or if you had a follow-up. Jason is commenting, yet we have a local lab that never makes a K recommendation, no matter their test level. Huge disservice to growers.
And that goes back to the old adage that in Western Canada, we have all kinds of potash in our soils. And I just showed you that 200 ppm of potash in your clay soils is not enough.
Nathan is saying that was helpful. Thank you. Jason is saying, what about potassium acetate? I love it.
Potassium acetate is a fantastic source of potassium. And what I mean by that is, again, if you look at how potassium is taken up by the plant, even at the root surface or on the leaf surface, is taken up through the process of facilitated diffusion. And the rate of facilitated diffusion is based on the point of deliquescence of the nutrients you're putting on. And potassium acetate has a point of deliquescence of about 28%. In other words, you only need about 28% humidity for potassium acetate to go back into the solution and be taken up by the plant. Whereas a potassium chloride or even a potassium sulfate, those forms of potassium have a point of deliquescence over 90%. So you have to have over 90% humidity just to get that taken up by the plant tissue. Now I'm talking more foliar application than I am ground application. But the nice thing about potassium acetate, even if I put that in a side dress, is it's low phytotoxicity to the plant and just more easily available to the plant.
Bada boom, bada bing. I'm just glad I could say it. Acetate.
So I want to talk about how the potassium moves on and off the soil particles. So when we apply potassium to the soil, every time the soil absorbs potassium, it releases potassium. So I can actually stimulate potassium release when I apply potassium in low potassium soils. So if you have a low potassium load soil, your base saturation is low, every time I apply even a little bit of potassium, I'm getting a release to the plant. So I can induce potassium release. If I look at what's going to happen over time, eventually, if I have low base saturation potassium, my potassium is going to get fixed or unavailable to plant very quickly. So again, I can stimulate release by putting more potassium on. So if I have very low base saturation and I want to just get the most out of my fertilizer dollar, rather than put 200 pounds at once, every time I put it on, if I put it on smaller amounts, I'm going to get better utilization of that potassium. Did we have a question?
Jason commented, we will use half-liter in-furrow even if we are close to ratio balance on the potassium acetate.
Again, you should never plant a crop without potassium in the furrow. The reason for that is we get better crop production the earlier we plant. The earlier we plant, the colder the soils are, the less availability you have to potassium. And I need that potassium early. A plant takes up 3 pounds of potassium for every 1 pound of nitrogen it takes up in early spring. Throughout the growing season, it's 1 for 1. But in the early season, it needs a lot more potassium to make things happen relative to nitrogen. And if I don't have available potassium, I'm really causing a reduction in yield potential because the yield's being built in that early stage. So yes, absolutely.
That's it for now,
So
Greg.
if we look at potassium behavior in soil, so this is just a model of potassium in soil solution, potassium fixed and exchangeable. So when we're sitting at kind of equilibrium, steady state, it's kind of nothing happening here. There's no change in equilibrium. What we have to do is assume that there's exchangeable potassium is available at time of the growth demand we need. So can that soil get the potassium? Is potassium available to the plant at least as fast as the plant is demanding it? That's kind of what we have to predict. If we look at this model here, when I apply potassium, I have a lot more potassium moving into the soluble form as opposed to the fixed or easily exchangeable. But as this soil comes to equilibrium, that will slow down and I'll have more readily exchangeable and fixed as opposed to soil solution. And that happens, and how fast that happens or how fast that soil comes to equilibrium is also dependent on what my base saturation is. So the higher my base saturation, the longer the period of time before this soil actually comes back to equilibrium and the potassium gets fixed. So again, maintaining a higher level of potassium in the soil means that your soil is a lot more reactive or making potassium more available to the plant. When we look at a soil where we need a lot of potassium available, in some soils, 2 to 4 part per million per day is available to a plant. We look at something like a potato crop during bulking, we need 5 to 7 pounds per day. And in a lot of cases, there's just no way some of these soils can provide that. So that's why we continue to apply potassium to this crop. We apply it in large amounts to make sure that we can force that release, force the soil to stay, not go into equilibrium and fix this potassium, and just make sure there's more available to the crop through the growing season. So it's a game that we have to play in understanding how this nutrient is actually released by soil, how the coefficient of diffusion works in soils to make potassium more available, because it does have right from day one, right through to finish, a big influence on overall yield. Any questions on that before I go into that? This is a part we're not going to like. This is soil chemistry.
Why won't we like it?
Okay. Well, I put it in here because when I talk about availability, I talk about base saturation of the cations. Base saturation of the cations and understanding what that optimal range should be across different soils is an understanding of, in simple terms, the coefficient of diffusion. If my coefficient of diffusion if my base saturation is high, my coefficient of diffusion potential is greater because I have more availability of that cation able to move off of the soil particle. So we look at diffusion as the main movement of nutrients to a diffusion concentration gradient, and our effective diffusion increases with increasing, in this case, potassium. So we look at the availability of K in a well-fertilized soil versus a depleted soil. You can see very simply here from this graph that a well-fertilized soil or a base saturation of K up in the optimum range and high optimum range is going to release a lot more potassium, or the coefficient of diffusion is much higher. When we look at differences in soil types and diffusion, looking at the effective diffusion rate, again, across different soils, the coefficient of diffusion in water, again, soil solution, is greater than the coefficient of diffusion off the soil particle itself. So when we have a lot of moisture around, I'm getting more availability of nutrient because the availability of plant in soil solution is greater than the plant taking it off the soil particle. So we need to understand that because the model uses both. So look at the effective coefficient of diffusion. There's a part of that formula that includes the volume of water in the soil. There's a part of that formula that also includes the impedance of the water, the soil itself, how well it's aggregated, how compact it is, all that kind of stuff. And then the diffusion coefficient of the element itself on soil makes up that whole equation. So you look at that equation where it comes from. The greater the clay content in the soil, The higher the buffering capacity, or the greater the nutrient hold, or nutrient grocery bag, if you will, the greater the soil's ability to provide nutrient based on percent exchangeable ion. Therefore, the higher CEC soils have a greater buffering capacity, or the greater ability to provide nutrients to the growing crop. In other words, your heavy clay soils have a lot more power and a lot more ability. However, if we don't have them to a certain saturation point, they are so fixed, it's going to be a hard time getting the nutrient available to the plant. Looking at a rule of thumb here, a concentration of K and phosphate availability. Again, the top soil, soil B, is a sandier soil type, low clay content, whereas the soil A is higher in clay. You can see that right next to the root, there's a very large depletion zone. The clay soil has the ability to make up that depletion zone a lot better than the sand soil. So again, your clays have the ability, given they've got enough moisture and the concentration is high enough, to provide nutrition to a crop over and above sands. A sandier soil, we need to be spoon feeding that crop more because, again, around the root zone, it's depleted very fast because the coefficient of diffusion from a sand is much lower than a clay. Okay, that's just saying the same sort of thing, but understanding the ability for that soil type to buffer that. Any questions on that? So what I'm saying here is, without going to Marshner and reading coefficient of diffusion, those are snippets right out of Marshner. What I'm saying is, we can basically look at percent saturation of potassium, magnesium, and calcium on the soil particle, and the optimum ranges we've put together as an understanding of what the coefficient of diffusion, the effective coefficient of diffusion, would be for that soil, given certain times. So when I look at base saturation, as my soil moisture availability goes down, in other words, I'm in more dryland situation, my base saturation of these nutrients has to be higher to make up the differential, if that makes sense. So looking at a soil with a soil test level of 150 part per million and a CEC of 10 and 3.8% saturation, and we're just looking at what that coefficient of diffusion could look like. 0.5 pounds of K is required to produce 100 weight of potato. If a potato requires 3.4 to 3.8 pounds of K per day during bulking, where it's putting down 5 to 700 weight per day, the diffusion rate of this soil, based on another chemistry measures diffusion rate, is 177 part per million of K per day, or about 6.5 pounds of K per acre foot of soil to feed that crop, which is really close to what that crop's demand needs, because we also have to understand that nutrient use efficiency for potassium on potatoes is only about 40%. So 40% of 6.4, we're right borderline with 3.8% saturation of K. So growing a crop of potatoes, and I only have 3.8% saturation and a CEC of 10, where I want to have 3 to 5%, I need to increase my load of potassium in that soil to make sure I can meet these deficiencies or these needs, or I need to be ready to go in and top dress or side dress potassium to that crop at bulking stage. So there's ways of getting around it, but the easiest way is to have it in the soil, to make sure it's there, to build that soil to a level of about 4.5%, so that I can meet these demands. Make sense? Everybody with me on this?
Any questions or comments for Greg at this time? It looks like we're golden for now. I'll let you know, Greg. Thank you.
Now, I know there's not a lot of corn producers we're talking to today, but I use this one because it's well documented and well researched and in the literature. This is a crop of corn, and we're looking at Roy Flannery's work with 308 bushel of corn. And I'm just showing you how much potassium is taken up through the growing stage of that crop. And you can see here at peak potassium demand, we need 15 pounds of potash per day available to that crop. There's just no way our soils have the ability to do that. And that's why a lot of growers today are looking at side dressing or top dressing potassium, just like they do nitrogen, on some of these high yield corn crops. Now, we're getting away with it. We're getting it because guys are pounding the fertilizer to these high yielding fields, and when they get the moisture, it works. But we got to make sure if we're going to continue to move forward in these high yields that we have consistent response, and that has a lot to do with the overall fertility balance and how we build these soils and how we understand how this crop needs to respond, and that whole coefficient of diffusion and how that correlates to base saturation. And we look at Fisher's formulas, how we can look at and estimate what the optimal level of a nutrient needs to be in that soil based on that soil type, and what the expected release rate will be based on the interpretation of that same data.
Nathan is saying that corn is king over there, wherever there is. I'm not sure where you're from, Nathan, to be honest. You can put that in the chat. Jason is saying this makes me sure we can get to 200 bushel wheat on pivots here if we get the K moving.
Absolutely. I mean, I've got growers that I work with that get 200, 250 plus of winter wheat. I've got growers that get consistently 150 bushel of spring wheat, but they're putting it on very, very productive soils, good fertility balance, and obviously they got moisture.
Nathan's near Brooks, so it sounds like he'd probably be one of the rednecks that would come out if he went to Lethbridge.
There you go.
Is that fair, Nathan?
So I guess what I just want to emphasize again, looking at this chart that we use making recommendations, and we go from one yield level up to another yield level, and looking at Fisher's constant of 110 part per million as a base for potassium. And as I move up to higher yields in any crop, that base will be 140 part per million. So we need to establish what we look at. The SLAN approach is what is that optimum level of the different nutrient based on that soil type, and then what is the removal rate, and then how is that adjusted based on the CEC. And you can see here, and I'll use another interpretation here, this is Jay Johnson's work out of Ohio State in '76, again looking at Fisher's work and how he used the SLAN approach of 110 ppm for this corn crop plus 2.5 times the cation exchange capacity to come up with what the optimum level of potassium be for that soil type. In his work, he also found that soybeans are hungry for potassium. So in the same growing situation with the same average yields, I got to start with 140 part per million from SLAN's approach, added to that 2.5 times the CEC. So again, this is Fisher's hybrid formula, where we're using the SLAN approach of optimal levels plus an adjustment for soil type variation using that 2.5 times cation exchange capacity. So we look at why we need to do this. If I have a soil type, I don't care what the crop is, my CEC 16, the ideal base saturation of potassium is 3 to 5%. And let's say I'm at 3%, 187 ppm of potash. I've got good soil moisture. That should grow a pretty decent crop of corn or crop of anything, provided the inputs I'd normally put on. But as my conditions go to higher yields or poor moisture, I'm going to have to be up closer to 5% saturation, okay, or 300 ppm to do the same job. So again, relative to your crop demand or your environmental conditions, basically rainfall or soil moisture, we need to adjust and look at where the optimum levels need to be and the base saturation or the predictable release rate of these elements in order to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. Now, anybody can grow a crop in a good year. I mean, that's understood. But that's not what makes money for farming. Farming is basically where we make money is having some kind of consistent crop out of a field year over year. And if anybody does do a regular soil sampling, they'll know that their better fertility is a field that performs uniformly year over year. And that's kind of what we're trying to say here. Understand what the environment is, understand where that nutrient load needs to be based on soil type so that you can manage the different field. And also, as I said earlier, I wouldn't grow a crop that's a high feeder, high input cost on a field that needs work. I would build the field up, put in some lower input cost crop, at least gives me some kind of return, while I spend the time to build that soil to be more manageable for all kinds of different crops. So Fisher's formula and how to look at that when we make recommendations based on CEC, you can see for this CEC of 17 to 20, if I do the calculation here using his Fisher formula, factor of 110 for that level, and compare that to a higher clay content, you can see the top one to have, look at optimum levels, 2.3% saturation decay, or as they move up into a higher yield level, they have to be 3.1%. On the higher clay, at that number of 187 is 1.9%, which is just slightly lower than I want to be. But as they move up into a higher yield level, I would have to be about 2.4% to have enough potassium availability to do the job. So we can make the quick calculations once you understand what your soil type looks like. We do that for you on a soil report, but you just need to know that there's differences in different soil types. I think we had a question. You're on mute, Dan.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just had Jill saying that she's heading out to her appointment. So thanks, Jill, for contributing the CEU credits. I'll put them up here shortly, I guess, when Greg wraps up.
Okay. I'm just about done. I just want to wrap up with this slide. This slide's based on the work we've done on soil health. We know now, and we've got literature, anybody's interested, I think some of you have already got it, our chapter 23 out of James White's book, where we've looked at all the different soil parameters and how it stimulates the microbial population in the soil. We know that when we look at our soil health test here and based on the soil health index, we know which organism we're stimulating. We know which ones are the indicator species we need to get better productivity. And we know through balanced fertility and understanding with these different relationships how we stimulate those organisms. We talked a lot about K to magnesium ratio and potassium. Didn't talk a lot about phosphorus today, but they're all important. We know that one of the most aggressive organisms in our soils is Pseudomonas. It's very, very dependent on good phosphorus levels, even though it solubilizes a lot of phosphorus to the plant. But it needs to have decent soil levels before it even comes to the party. The problem with this, and another reason why I'm concerned about us moving back away from understanding Fisher's formulas and the Albrecht approach, is that if we have low P levels, or we have low K levels in our soils, or low fertility, not only do we not cultivate the beneficial organisms, we cultivate the opportunistic ones. So if we have a low phosphorus level in the soil, we actually encourage a form of Pseudomonas to come into the rhizosphere that actually produces Fusarium. So a lot of our disease suppression and a lot of the stimulation of these microbes that are going to help us in the future solubilize these nutrients or reduce disease in soils is going to be dependent on how we deliver nutrition to the plant so the plant can cultivate these organisms. So we're coming at it from two different directions now. We're looking at how we can get a healthier soil, how we can capture carbon, how we can increase organic matter, but how we can have a consistent crop. And the big thing that's going to come at us in the near future, and I'm involved in a couple of projects now with a couple of large processors in North America, nutrient density is a new thing everybody's interested in. And even McDonald's people are forcing their producers to focus on nutrient density. So even a French fry you eat every day, you have the processors really concerned about the way that crop's being grown because their focus is providing a better, healthier food.
That's good news.
That's all I got for today.
Jason says, finally, nutrient density is huge. Well, thank you again, Greg. Bravo. That was incredible. Yeah, we have to go back through the transcript to find out what just happened. But those transcripts are highly functional. So I'm looking forward to posting those. Anybody else have any questions before we wrap up here? Nathan said, thank you for an incredible episode. Can you, I don't know if you have to stop sharing for me to share, but I'm going to share the
yeah, I think I have to.
CEU credits here for anybody. Participants can now see your application. Can you see that? The QR code there? and make that work. Greg, you need to get them as well.
Yeah, I got them. It worked.
Okay. Well, that's incredible what you shared there today, and some great corrective thinking, some great expanding thinking. Continues to expand the novel. Our next session will be a month from today. And
maybe not from today, but we'll have to put that up sometime.
Roughly speaking. If anybody else has any topics or questions they want to hear, Greg's in the community. You can just tag him and he'll get a message.
And anybody interested in our level 2, just contact Sierra. We have room yet.
I'm going to put Sierra's, if I may, I can put Sierra's email into the chat here too.
Please.
Sierra S. Stacy at AL Canada. I just throw it in the chat here. So Stacy at alcanada.com, and hopefully everybody got their CEU credits. Thanks again, Jill. Thanks for all the participants and the members of the mastermind. We can continue to grow together here. Greg, any final comments?
Well, I appreciate everybody signing in. I know that was a little bit dry for what most people do in the field, but the message I'm trying to make here is we're getting forces out there now that are trying to take us backwards. They're trying to tell us that we don't need fertilizer to grow a crop. They're telling us that soil types don't matter. And I've been working with crop production and grower groups for over 40 years. And I'll tell you, if we don't pay attention, we're not going to be successful.
Love it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. We'll see you in the next mastermind. Take care. Thanks, Greg.
Bye now.